Great news. COVID-19 vaccines have created at least 9 new billionaires. Meanwhile, over here, when we talk about extreme poverty, which has, by the way, been declining pretty rapidly, actually, at a pretty good tick over the past few decades, or had been declining, COVID hit, and that's back on the upswing pretty strongly. More people starving. So there are two ways to look at this in my mind. On the one hand, one school of thought might be, and this is what I see in some of the headlines and how they're positioning this enrichment of the rich on the backs of poor people throughout the COVID pandemic. One way to look at it is, wow, these heroes are getting rewarded for their hard work saving lives through COVID. That's one way to look at it. Remember when they were evil and monopolizing our health and making billions and billions of dollars already off of their nefarious practices, getting sued all over the place. Remember Vioxx? Remember how we used to not trust these companies at all? A lot of the data in those cases is sealed, unfortunately. But we know that they've had to pay out millions for fraud, for lying to us over and over and over again. But no big deal. Now they're saving lives with the COVID vaccine. So they're now our heroes. It's great. It's great that they're making money off of this. Because if there's anything we should be making money off of, it should be saving lives, right? That's one school of thought. The other school of thought is there seems to be a great deal of incentive for these companies to perpetuate the cycle of this pandemic for financial gain. But that's being extreme, right? Because surely they're not driving these government policies, right? Surely they're not driving our actual legislation. Surely they're not driving science. That would be crazy. Surely not. Science is independently happening over here in a vacuum. And then the rest of us, including the pharmaceutical industry and the government, are just receiving the science from these unbiased scientists and going, oh, here's the science. Let's act based on that. That's how it works, right? Okay, let's talk about the legal drug cartel. So I actually want to back up and do a quick history lesson. First of all, do you like my new microphone? If you're watching this on video, you notice this is now the aspect ratio is different. Hopefully the audio is better. I'm a poor excuse for a millennial. I'm an older millennial, which means I don't have to be good at technology. Actually, that's the younger millennials and then younger generation's jobs. As an older millennial, I get to very, very slowly adapt and learn new technology. True story, I had an iPhone for years before my roommate at the time. I was like, it's just not working. I don't know why it's not working. And he was like, well, have you plugged it into your computer and updated it? And I was like, what are you talking about? I have no idea these things of which you speak. I learn, but slowly and only when I have to. And usually I get halfway through a YouTube tutorial and I'm like, that's enough. That's fine. I'll roll with this and figure the rest out. Thankfully, I'm not so lazy when it comes to researching the pharmaceutical industry. As you'll see throughout this podcast, I'm going to talk in very layman's terms because some of the language of the far right felt inaccessible to me at the beginning. Now it makes a lot more sense, but at the beginning, as I was kind of just dipping my toes into these waters, because I had swam in the liberal waters for a while, and I was like, oh, it looked really pretty when I was on the beach, but as I stepped into the waters and got deeper and deeper, it got dirtier and dirtier under the surface. This is nasty. So as I started dipping my toes into the conservative waters and doing my own research and looking at more fringe kind of sources, I found some of the language inaccessible. It's these oligarchs and conspiracies and it's the billionaires and they're blah, 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 blah. And I was like, whoa, I don't know what you mean. You just sound crazy. And so hopefully over the course of this podcast, some things that I've done more research on, I'm probably going to use terminology and put it in a way that does make me sound crazy if you're brand new to this stuff. And that's okay. We're all a little bit crazy if we're being honest. But I'm going to try to just like do these podcasts in semi-real time, like just maybe a beat or two behind when I've been uncovering it, so that I can still talk to you from the fresh perspective of just having discovered this stuff for myself. And hopefully just put it in language that made sense to me. Because sometimes when, people we look to for information, while they may be like really credible and awesome, they've been inundated in this for a long time. And so they speak sometimes in kind of inaccessible language, because they're 10 steps ahead of where I am, to be honest. So what I want to do is actually take a step back and do a little history lesson. So this is an article I found. It's a deep dive, and it is on the NIH website. It's right here on the NIH website. And it's a deep dive kind of white paper analysis of how did the tobacco industry get away with their lies around cigarettes for so long after. I'm not talking about before we knew that smoking caused lung cancer. I'm talking about after. And really what this paper is about is the invention of the idea of conflicts of interest between industry and science, ultimately. And as I was reading through this, I don't even remember how I happened upon it, because it has nothing overtly to do with the pharmaceutical industry or with all of these crazy things that are happening in our world right now, overtly. But as I was reading through it, the parallels to me are chilling. And so I'm just going to, for starters, just kind of take you through. This is way too long to read. I will link it in the show notes so that you can take a look for yourself at the whole white paper. But I'm just going to read a few excerpts piece by piece, because I think what this did for me is I was like, oh, this was a complete blueprint for the pharmaceutical industry to just take and run with and perfect this art of conflicts of interest and the manipulation of public perception around what the science is. So this starts off really the situation is the industry so where we are is in the 1950s. So categorical means it's really hard to argue. Like it's pretty much it's fact. Like it's capital F fact that smoking is a cause of lung cancer. So confronted by this, the tobacco industry used sophisticated public relations approaches to undermine and distort the emerging science. So after this point, after we know this, after, the science leads us to this conclusion that, unfortunately, this is a cause of lung cancer. What are we going to do about it? The tobacco industry goes, all hands on deck. And what happened from here is for decades after this knowledge was made public, the tobacco industry successfully manipulated us as a public. They manipulated educational research, like higher education research. They manipulated the government. They manipulated scientists. They manipulated physicians. They manipulated everybody to allow their industry to not only survive, but to thrive and grow after we knew it caused lung cancer by just creating, I'm going to lay out a few things that they did, little like best in class practices if you want to do this yourself in your industry, how to manipulate everybody 101. Okay, so they worked essentially to create a scientific controversy, that doesn't sound familiar, through a program that depended on the creation of industry academic conflicts of interest. So their work, they knew, was going to depend on creating conflicts of interest at multiple levels, as you'll see. So a number of industries have subsequently followed this approach to disrupting normative science. Claims of scientific uncertainty and lack of proof also lead to the assertion of individual responsibility for industrially produced health risks. For pharmaceutical company produced health risks. I mean, insert the pharmaceutical industry at any point. Feel free. Any systematic investigation of the modern relationship of medicine and science to industry must consider basically what happened in the case of the tobacco industry. But the steps this industry took as it fashioned a new relationship with the scientific enterprise have become a powerful and influential model for the exertion of commercial interests within science and medicine since that time. So in this sense, the tobacco industry invented the modern problems of conflict of interest. And my argument is going to be from heretofore within, therefore thou art, that if they invented it, the pharmaceutical industry has perfected this art. Man, they're good. Okay, by late 1953, smoking had been categorically linked to the dramatic rise of lung cancer. Linked. So smoking is on the rise. Oh, then there's this dramatic increase of lung cancer. I'm not even going to say what, no, I'll say what I want to say. This is probably going to be censored and taken off platforms, but whatevs. Reminds me a little bit of how how the vaccines required for children 0 through 18 went from 20 something in the early 80s to all of a sudden they've increased it. Now today they're 92, something like that. Maybe 72 is the number. Let's go with 72 just to be conservative about it. But as this dramatic boom in the vaccines that were being required for our infants, for pregnant women vaccine, that wasn't a thing before the 80s. But around the time I was born, it was 20 something, dramatically boomed. And during that time, what did we see? A dramatic boom in childhood cancer. But what we're still being told today is nothing to see here. And we're distorting. We'll talk about that in a later episode. I digress. My apologies. I would edit that part out if I knew how to edit videos, but I only got halfway through that YouTube tutorial. As a result, the tobacco industry would launch a new strategy, largely unprecedented in the U.S. history of industry and business up until this point. It would work to erode, confuse, and condemn the very science that now threatened to destroy its prized, highly popular, and exclusive product. Okay, so what happened next? Within the industry, marketing experts had developed a powerful notion of social engineering, what early public relations theorists had called the engineering of consent. According to this logic, society and culture could be manipulated through public relations to create a marketing environment that favored a particular product, in this case, the cigarette. So it's marketing, but when we talk about this public relations campaign, we're talking about way more than just like good old-fashioned marketing. They knew that marketing and advertising was inherently a conflict, like it was inherently a conflict of interest. Like you're paying to convince people to use your product. They had to get creative and go beyond traditional marketing and advertising. They had to get all in our government's business, all in our public universities, like research universities' business. They had to get all up in everybody's business, all up in science's business. If public relations could engineer consent among consumers, so too could it manage the science that was now threatening to undermine the industry. So they said, let's take our great PR strategies and successes among the general public. Let's PR this science stuff. So how did they engineer science? The tobacco industry's program to engineer the science relating to the harms caused by cigarettes marked a watershed in the history of the industry. It moved aggressively into a new domain, the production of scientific knowledge, not for the purposes of research, not because we want to know, but to undo what was already known and to kind of quell that and silence it. How do they do that? How does the pharmaceutical industry do this, by the way? Well, they have the money. They can fund study after study after study. Why don't we have studies about ivermectin for the early treatment of COVID-19? We don't really have that many, at least not many large studies, because ivermectin's like cheap as F. It's too cheap. Nobody can make money off of it. So who's going to fund that study? Is our government going to fund that study? No. The tobacco industry was able to drive science because they could essentially pay for all of this new science to be noisy enough and loud enough and prominent enough to edge out, like, let's just get out this like real science, this real like unbiased true science, like the science of the past. Let's elbow that out. Let's quiet that because we're going to talk louder, because we're going to fund all of these studies that just create reasonable doubt that smoking causes lung cancer. It's going to create science that points like, oh, look over there. It actually, like, smoking's actually caused by smoking. Lung cancer is actually caused by a lot of different things. Oh, and let's do studies on the benefits of smoking. Have we considered the benefits? So just a bunch of red herrings, a bunch of distractors, and a bunch of confusion and controversy that this created. Does that sound familiar? Anybody else like is anybody else like me and they look around at evidence in their life of, well, this vaccine doesn't seem to be working like they said it was. Well, this seems to be they said it was one, now it's this many. Well, they said that these cheap drugs they've demonized, but now they're coming out with new pharmaceutical drugs that are supposed to be antivirals, and those cost a lot of money, but those are okay. Okay. If science had historically been dedicated to the making of new facts, the industry campaign now sought to develop scientific strategy to unmake scientific fact. The goal was to disrupt the normative process of knowledge production in medicine, science, and public health. Okay, so the industry response, the public confidence in the industry required could not be achieved through advertising, which was self-interested by definition. I told you guys this. It would be crucial for them to assert their authority over the scientific domain. So simply denying emerging scientific facts would be a losing game. If we simply said, no, it doesn't, that's a losing game. If we simply denied, oh, people have been injured by the vaccine. No, they haven't. That would be a losing game if that's all we did. So they proposed seizing and controlling science rather than avoiding it. If science posed the principal and even terminal threat to the industry, what they did is they now associated themselves as the great supporters of science. These companies should actually embrace a sophisticated scientific discourse. They should demand more science, by golly, not less. Follow the science. We are the owners and the biggest supporters and proponents of science. Genius, right? Genius. And who wouldn't believe, by the way, that the pharmaceutical industry is the most interlinked, the greatest supporters of science. They must be. They're developing all these great drugs that we're putting into our body. Oh, wait, are they great drugs? Quick gut check. And by the way, I can save you guys a lot of time. I'll just link to this article, as well as this guy, John Abramson, wrote a book called Sickening. It just was released in February. Just a few gut checks on the pharmaceutical industry before I talk about how this story of cigarettes ended, because I know you're all wondering. I know nobody knows how that story ends. Coffee. The primary function of the drug companies, and this guy, by the way, I'm going to butcher his bio, but essentially he was involved. He's an expert in this area. He was involved in litigation against these pharmaceutical companies, and that was his primary focus for years and years. He got really passionate about it because, as he was called in to be a witness in one case and actually saw the raw data, as a court expert, he was actually given the raw data. None of us get the raw data, by the way. None of us have access to that. You know who has access to that? The pharmaceutical companies, and them alone. The regulations, our current laws stipulate that they don't have to be transparent in the data. They don't. They never have to release the raw data, nor do they ever release the raw data. What they do is they only release selectively their analysis of the raw data. So if they don't like how a study turns out, they just scrap it, start all over, set it up in a different way that's going to be favorable towards their particular product. Because remember, they're making billions. There's a little bit of incentive, aka conflict of interest, at play here when it comes to public health and the pharmaceutical industry. So what do? They scrap the study, do it all over again, and then can we spin this in a way that says, oh, maybe it wasn't effective at the thing that we said it would be, but it does this or something, and we can manipulate this data and release that analysis. So that's what we see. That's what our physicians see, more importantly. So this whole idea of evidence-based medicine sounds really great. I've trusted that for years and years myself, but what you might not realize about the pharmaceutical industry is that they're manipulating our physicians too, because our physicians only have access to their analysis, and they're sold very, very hard. They buddy up with our physicians. I don't think there's, nefarious intentions on the part of physicians. They are doing what they were taught to do, which is evidence-based medicine. The question is, what is the quality and the trustworthiness of the evidence that our physicians are seeing and basing our medical decisions on, and that we're seeing as end consumers. Not very great, because we don't see the data. We can't be trusted with the data, then we'd be able to make true informed decisions. And true informed consent is so overrated. Let's just trust it and swallow your pills. Pharmaceutical companies own the right. This is what I just said. They own the rights to their clinical trial data, so they can manipulate the success rates and side effects. The US does not have a system for health technology assessments. Drugs have done great things, but they're calling their own fouls. He uses that term, and I think it's ingenious. And why would you have a multi-billion-dollar industry that is calling their own fouls? Why? Why aren't they regulated by a third party, unbiased? And by unbiased, I mean somebody whose purse and wallet and bank account isn't impacted big time. Let's see what else. There's one more thing I wanted to read from this. Yeah, the U.S. has no cap on drug costs. Yeah, I guess that's it for now. I'll think of it. As you know already, my brain works all over the freaking place. So I'll be mid-sentence later on talking about a completely different topic, and I'll remember what I was going to say. Okay, let's get this going and finish this out. So what they proposed essentially and what they executed was a research program that would be controlled by the industry, yet promoted as independent. How many research studies do we have now on the vaccines, on COVID, on the virus itself, on all kinds of stuff that ultimately ladders up to who's funding it? Who's funding it? Guess. I'll give you one guess. But it's touted as independent. Most studies we see and trust are touted as independent. If y'all hear me clicking mid-episode, it's because my ring light automatically goes out. I can't keep any secrets, can I? And it makes my face look brighter. I'm sorry. I have to use that ring light. Okay. However, offering funds directly to university-based scientists would enlist their support and dependence. So they've enlisted, the tobacco industry in this case, have now enlisted the support and dependence on university-based scientists. And look, I don't think that any of these people, my gist, if I could get to a point, finally, my gist of this portion and reading through a couple of these excerpts was going to be, I don't think any of the people, it actually gets into this on this NIH article later. None of these people, they actually insisted, like, I'm not being manipulated. I'm not being controlled. I'm not dependent on their money. Nobody was walking around as a scientist going, like, not nobody, but most of these people thought that they were doing good work, that they thought they were doing real scientific work. Nobody was walking around going, I'm being manipulated. You know, when you're vulnerable, when you're being manipulated, you tend to not know it. And only begrudgingly did these people years and years later go, yeah, I had invisible puppet strings attached to me. I didn't know it. But they were unknowingly complicit in confusing the science and just supporting the tobacco industry's case. So I'm not saying that everybody involved in the perpetuation of this boom in the pharmaceutical industry has ill intent. I'm saying I would argue that most people actually don't. People keep calling me. I'm sorry for the buzzing. Okay. So they had no interest in answering a scientific question. Their goal was to maintain vigorous control over the research program, to use science. Here's a statement they made during that time. We accept an interest in people's health as a basic responsibility, paramount to every other consideration in our business. We believe the products we make are not injurious to health. We have and always will cooperate closely with those whose task it is to safeguard the public health. Don't they sound like heroes? So sweet of them. So they would consistently remind the public of these couple of things. There is no conclusive scientific proof of a link between smoking and cancer. They would also remind them medical research points to many possible causes of cancer. So they would reiterate this message for the next 40 years. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. We're just early on in this COVID thing. We're early on. Are we gonna have to go 40 years before all these lies are exposed? Are we gonna have to do that? I hope not. So then they secured academic support, conducted peer reviews of grant proposals after they had been carefully screened by the staff. So I think, again, what we probably imagine as pharmaceutical industries are just handing money over to universities going, please do the science, do it your way, and give us the science because we're just trying to help here. We're just trying to make great decisions. Give us your science. No, they're carefully screening people, choosing people they know will be supportive of their viewpoints, and screening studies in advance and approving them based on what they know the outcome will be. Sounds like science to me. Although the founding members would steadfastly defend their independence from the industry, the reality is that under this plan, they had been manipulated for effective public relations. So all of this ultimately cemented the relationship between academic researchers and industrial interests. With each passing year, skepticism concerning the relationship between smoking and cancer was increasingly dominated by industry resources and public media. Doubt was no longer a matter of culture or training, but the carefully crafted centerpiece of an industry effort to sow confusion and to heighten the debate through explicit attempts to disrupt normative science. So this is one of the most intensive efforts to do this. Others would subsequently follow this roadmap. It goes on to talk about how they called the other side, what was the word? Propaganda. Which is, I don't know if you guys have ever heard the word propaganda, because I don't think it's been used since the 1950s and all this whole PR campaign, but that's what the smoking industry did, is they called the science linking lung cancer to smoking cigarettes, they call it propaganda. These people are just haters. These people are just like, these are fringe, angry scientists who have gone off their rocker. Yeah, they used to be experts in their field, but now they're just like conspiracy theorists who are trying to push their propaganda on us because they're trying to take away a good thing. You know, they're jaded. They knew somebody who got lung cancer who happened to be a smoker. They're probably just At the same time that Hill and his colleagues were establishing all of this, they worked aggressively to reshape the media environment. So then it goes into the infiltration of the media. I'm going to leave that one alone until a later episode. So in their work to control the science, the companies had also found that they had secured considerable advantages in the realms of media, law, and public opinion. Surprisingly, the furor over smoking and health failed to send the industry into a slump. Instead, it sent it into an upheaval that has resulted in unforeseen growth and profits. When the tobacco companies say they're eager to find out the truth, they want you to think the truth isn't known. They want to be able to call it a controversy. Conflicts of interest, such as those invented by the tobacco industry, have the potential to undermine and corrupt the scientific enterprise in ways that do significant damage to what we know and how we deploy the knowledge process. The impact of the relationships that the industry built and developed were of truly great significance for public health. See you next time.